ClaySys is a rapid application development platform which allows you to create any line of business application, from very simple apps to very complex applications through just configuration. And it is a completely metadata-driven tool. You can create multiple applications on the same application infrastructure that you have set up ClaySys on, and each application will exist as a tenant. You could choose to use a brand new application or just use an existing tenant template, and you can use the existing modules supported in ClaySys for security workflow, or you could use the functionality to import an existing tenant. Clicking on New Tenant takes you to the tenant creation screen, and here in this example, I am creating a tenant called Northwind. Similar to the example Microsoft uses with their Northwind sample database in SQL Server, and I can give it a tenant code, a description, a logo, and if I want this application to work with a brand new SQL database, I can set up the access details of the SQL database in the tenant creation screen, or I can choose to work with an existing database that has already been set up in ClaySys, and that is what I'm going to do in the example here. So I'm going to select the SQL database to work with, and once I select the SQL database, I immediately get into the ClaySys Designer, where I can now create my application's modules and forms. I am going to now create a module, and as an example, I will call this module Contact Management. Within the Contact Management module of the Northwind tenant, I am going to create a contact form, and when I click Add Form, I will go into the Form Designer, where we have a WYSIWYG, or a What You See is What You Get design panel, to design the layout of the form. And you can see we have a toolbox with all of the controls and field types that you can have on a form. And you drag and drop the fields or controls you want onto your form to create the layout of the form. In this example, I have dragged a few text fields and a date field. And the objective is to show you how quickly I can create working functionality with ClaySys. I am going to drag and drop a few buttons so I can set up Save, Select, Edit options for the data on the form. Once you have the fields dragged and dropped onto the form, you can set the properties for each of the fields as you see here. The first field I have set up as a contact ID, which will be an auto-increment field, and I am disabling the field for data entry to ensure that the user is not able to enter data into this field. The second field in this example I am going to call First Name, and we will give it a label of First Name, and then I will have the next field as the Last Name field. Then the Date field, I'm going to use it for the Date of Birth field, and I will set the label as Date of Birth as well. You will notice that there are a whole range of field properties you can set for each of the fields. And I'm finally going to call the last text field as an email field to capture the email address for this contact. Now for the buttons, for the first button, I'm just going to call it the Save button because I want to save the data in the form when the user clicks this button and save it to the Northwind database. The next button I'm going to call Update, as what I would like to do is when I retrieve a contact using this form, I would like to edit and update the edited contact data back to the database. The next button I'm going to call Clear because after I have created and saved a contact, I would like to clear the form to enter the data for another contact. And the last button in this example is just going to be called Select, which I can use to search the contacts database with any value that I type into any of this form's fields, and it will retrieve the first contact with matching values it finds in the database. So it will retrieve the data and populate the form when I click on this Select button. Now I am setting properties to align the size of the buttons, which I can do on the design surface itself, or I can do it by setting the property for the button width. Once I have set up the form with the buttons, I am now going to save the form. After saving the form, I am just going to give the form a name, and I'm going to call this a contact form. I am setting the height and width of this form, which is also adjustable in the Form Properties window. Now I'm going to show you how to connect this contact form with its data source to read and write data to. If I go into my toolbox into the Data category of controls, I can drag and drop a data source control onto the contact form. I will call this data source the contact data source. And when I select the data source properties, you can see the various data sources supported. It could be a SQL database, stored procedures, SharePoint, web services, WCF services, etc. I am going to select SQL for this contact form example, and in the next step is the data source wizard is to select any one of the SQL databases configured for access, which is where I will select the Northwind database. Next, I can see all the tables and views available for this Northwind SQL database, to which I can configure the fields of my contact. I will select the contact table in this Northwind database. The next step in the wizard is where I can configure my data commands for select, insert, update, and delete. I have configured the insert, update, and select commands as you can see. Next, I have to set up the primary key for this table, which I will set as the contact ID field. And I will set up the contact field as an auto-increment field, as the value in field will be auto-incremented each time I save a contact to this table. I will now save the configuration of this form. I also need to set the properties for the buttons to trigger the required data source command when a user clicks each button. I have set the Save button to trigger the Insert command, the Update button to trigger the Update command, the Clear button to trigger the Clear command, and the Select button to trigger the Select command. This form is now ready to read and write data to the contact table of the Northwind database. If I click the Preview option, I can go into the preview mode of this form, where I can review how the form works for the end users. You can see that the contact ID field is not editable, so I go ahead and put in John Smith into the first name and last name field. I use the Date field control options to select any date to represent the date of birth. I can then put in the email address of this particular contact, and once I click the Save button, you can see that it has completed the save, meaning the contact data should be saved to the Northwind contact table. Now, if I click the Clear button to clear the form, and then type in John Smith's email address back into the email address field, and then click the Select button, you can see it retrieves the contact data that I had just saved earlier. Since I know now that this form works as required, I am going to save this form, and then you can see I have this check-in button on the designer that will let me check in the form to publish it to the end users, or I can save it as a draft to continue working on it by myself later. I am now checking the form to release it to the end users. The final step I have to do is configure this form to display when the right navigation menu item is clicked. Here I edit the form to display with the right height and width that I want. So, as you can see, we have just shown you in a few minutes how you can create a fully functional contact form to read and write data to a SQL database using the ClaySys platform.